Have you ever wondered how we went from the first powered heavier than air flight in 1903 to having fighter planes in World War One just 8 years later? It's quite a jump in advancement when you think about it. And by the end of World War One, we had a myriad of different planes. We had dogfights and we had thousands, tens of thousands of pilots. So, how did this all happen so quickly? Let's get into it. Hello and welcome. Campbell here from Autodidactic. Hope you're having a fantastic day. And today we're going to have a look at a bit of the history of flight and the story that we've been told. And we're going to see if it makes any sense at all. So, we've all heard about the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright. And they are, of course, put up as the brothers who made the first powered heavier than air flight. And this flight was done in 1903. And here we are on mps.gov and the Wright brothers. And this is the narrative of the history of flight. And they tell us that there was heavier than air flight before the Wright brothers, but not powered with an engine. And if we look around here, it tells us that, there were other people that were doing the flights, and they were even trying to get flights with engines, but it came down to the Wright brothers to get it right. And so in 1903 in North Carolina, down at the beach, or just south of Kitty Hawk, they took the first powered flights. And interesting to know that it was done at a place called Big Kill Devil Hill. I find that quite interesting as well. But the story goes that on December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers were on the beach and they were ready for their second attempt at powered flight. And it tells us there was a bit of wind going around, it wasn't the perfect day, but they gave it a go anyway. And they powered up the machine, they powered up the engine in their aeroplane, which was called the Wright Flyer. And this was the second flight. Wilbur did the first flight, which did not get off the ground. And so Orville took the second flight and he went down in history as the first man to fly. Now, it was 10:30 in the morning. The flyer moved down the rail as Wilbur steadied the wings, and just as Orville left the ground, John Daniels from the life-saving station snapped the shutter on a preset camera. So we actually have a photo of the first powered flight, which again is quite interesting, right? Down on a beach, 1903, but they happen to have a camera there. And how far did they fly on this first flight? Well, they flew about 50 feet. They were in the air, well, Orville was, for 12 seconds. And that went down as the first powered flight. They did another 3 flights on the same day. And the fourth and the last flight of the day was an impressive 850 feet. And they were in the air for 59 seconds. So not even a minute. And this was the start of powered flight. And here's another photo of the Wright Flyer. There was actually 3, but this is obviously the first one, the first one to achieve heavier than air powered flight. And how did they do it? They did it with an engine. They obviously had to have an engine. Now, this engine, they looked around and they couldn't find any engines that would, that suited their requirements. So they actually built one. And here it is, the 1903 Wright engine. And it was basically a 4-cylinder engine made of cast aluminium. And if you look down here at how they built the engine, the actual engineer who built it says, we didn't make any drawings. One of us would sketch out the part that we were talking about on a piece of scratch paper, and I'd spike the sketch over to my bench. It took me 6 weeks to make the engine. The only metal working machines we had here were a lathe and a drill press. run by belts from the stationary gas engine. The crankshaft was made out of a block of machined steel, 6 by 31 inches, and between 1 and 5/8 inches thick. So basically, this was a fairly simple little engine, 4-cylinder, that they made. Like they said, they only had a lathe and a drill press. So it was mainly made by hand, and it weighed about 90 kilograms. And this was how they got off the air and stayed up there for almost a minute on their fourth try. So the story goes, we've all heard this story. And of course, the Wright brothers, they started off as bicycle salesmen. Well, first of all, they started off, the story says that they had a printing press and they were making, the printing machines and selling them. And then they got into bicycles and they were making and selling bicycles. So we see here the Wright brothers, Orville Wright and Wilbur Wright, were American aviation pioneers, generally credited with inventing, building, and flying the world's first successful airplane. They made the first controlled sustained flight of an engine-powered heavier-than aircraft with the Wright Flyer on December 17, 1903, 4 miles or 6 kilometers south of Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, at what is now known as Kill Devil Hills. In 1904, the Wright brothers developed the Wright Flyer 2, which made longer durations in flights, including the first circle, followed by a fixed-wing aircraft, the Wright Flyer 3, in 1905. It goes down into a bit of the information here. We're on Wikipedia, just talking about how they improved, the controls and the wings, and it was all about them basically working out the lift, with the wings and how they would get lift and running it through wind tunnels and all this kind of stuff. And then we get down to, that they started a printing factory and made most of their money selling the printing presses. And then in 1892, on the back of the national bicycle craze, spurred by the invention of the safety bicycle, which had substantial advantages over the penny farthing, and the safety bicycle is basically the same design we see today. And they started up the Wright Cycle Company, and in 1896 began manufacturing their own brand of bicycles, which they sold. Now, this is their bicycle. So I want you to have a look at this picture and imagine the bicycles that we have today. And just think, how different are they to this bicycle? I mean, they're basically the same, right? This is what we get today. If you're looking at this kind of a bike that they use, for races and that, this is what you will get. The same kind of frame, same seats, same wheels, same crank setup. It's literally the same bike. And we are now 121 years later, or even more, because this one was made in the 1890s. So it's interesting, isn't it, that in 100, probably 125, 130 years, this design has not really changed at all. At all. But what has happened to the aeroplanes? They have changed quite a bit. So what I really want to get into with this talk about aeroplanes and flights is World War One. And World War One went from the 28th of July 1914 until the 11th of November 1918. So it started just 11 years after the Wright brothers flew, on their fourth flight for a grand total of 59 seconds. Okay, first day that that man apparently had done heavier than air powered flight. And then we go forward just 11 years and we hit World War One. Now, World War One was the first major conflict involving large-scale use of aircraft. Tethered balloons used for observation had already been employed in several wars, and they would be used extensively for artillery spotting. The Germans used Zeppelins for reconnaissance, etc., etc. And airplanes were just coming into military use at the outset of the war. Initially used mostly for reconnaissance, pilots and engineers learned from experience, leading to the development of many specialized types, including fighters, bombers, and trench strafers or straffers. So just 11 years after the first powered flight, we hit World War One, and this was the first war that used planes. Okay, in 1911, there was a meeting of the Institute of International Law in Madrid, and legislation was proposed to limit the use of aeroplanes to reconnaissance missions and ban them from being used as platforms for weapons. This legislation was rooted in the fears that aeroplanes would be used to attack undefended cities. So that's all well and good, but if you look at World War II, they seem to have forgotten this, because in World War II, you know, we all know of the Battle of Britain. Most people who are familiar with my channel will know about the bombing of Dresden and other cities that were completely destroyed by air attacks. So this Institute of International Law seemed to have dropped the ball a little bit going into World War II. But at the start of World War One, there was some debate over the usefulness of aircraft in warfare. Many senior officers in particular remained skeptical. However, the initial campaigns of 1914 proved that the cavalry could no longer provide reconnaissance expected by their generals, and so they needed to employ aircraft. Even so, the air reconnaissance played a critical role in the War of Movement of 1914. So this is the first year of the war, 1914. Again, 11 years after the flight at Kitty Hawk. And they already had planes that they were using for reconnaissance. And as the war went on, they started developing more planes. As we're told up here, they started to develop fighters and bombers and trench straffers. And here we have some pictures of aeroplanes from the First World War. So as you can see, this technology jumped ahead fairly quickly, especially when compared to the bicycle. And when you think that, you know, the bicycle was much more widely used than aeroplanes, you know, you could buy a bicycle and hop on it and ride it. You didn't need to train as a pilot. You didn't need to know about lift and wind conditions, air conditions, you know, how to fly the plane, how to maneuver it. None of this was needed on a bicycle. But, you know, clearly to fly an airplane, you need, you know, quite a bit of knowledge so that you don't fall. And of course, you know, if you fall off a bicycle, you might scratch your knee. If you fall out of the sky in an airplane, if you don't know what you're doing, the results are a bit more tragic, right? So this is what we had in World War One, list of World War One aircraft. And look at all these planes. Okay, we had some airships, 1908, that these were used in World War One. But then, as you can see, all of these planes, a bomber from 1916. Down here, 1912, we had a reconnaissance plane, we have trainer planes, we have fighter planes. And look at this list. It's huge. This is what happened within the 4 years of World War One. This is what was developed. All of these different planes. And like I said, it doesn't make a lot of sense. We are told that they advanced so much technologically in navigation and aeronautics because of the war. You know, they always tell us, right, the war, you know, it pushes innovation because you have to beat the bad guy and all this kind of stuff. I think most of us know what wars are for at this point. You know, they're nothing like we're told. They're all orchestrated. They are to make money and to wipe out, you know, the old world, right? The imprints of the old world. That's what a war is, at least the ones that we've had in the 1900s. And this is just so you can see the number of aircraft used in World War One. Okay, we had 68,000 French, 58,000 British, got 48,000 here, 20,000, 15,000, 4,700, 5,500. Now, all of these planes needed pilots. So that's one question, is who was training all the pilots, apart from who was building all of these aeroplanes? Because obviously to build these aeroplanes, you need factories, right? And to get that many built, we're talking this was all done in 4 years. Hundreds of thousands of planes were built. But the first mechanical assembly line was made by Henry Ford, and that was in 1913, of course, to make his Model T Ford, right? And that was introduced 5 years after the actual Model T. And that's really, at least this is what we're told, is that was the reason that it was so popular, because with an assembly line, he could get them built quickly and cheaply. And, we've all heard the line that, anyone could have a Model T in any color they wanted, as long as it was black, because that was the assembly line. They made them one way and they made them cheaply so they could get out to, the common man, as they say. So the first assembly line wasn't even around as far as making a mechanical machine until 1913, the year before World War I started. So all of these planes were built basically by hand. Okay, most of them were in Europe. The assembly lines were started in the USA. So most of these were built in Europe, and going on the facts that we're given, they didn't have assembly lines, or at the very least, they would have been very new. And, you need to train people up to run assembly lines. You need all the machinery. So how were they building this amount of aircraft? Okay, we can see down here, we've got frontline combat aircraft, thousands of them. And then we've got the aircraft that were lost or shot down, 50,000 just in France. All right, 35,000 in Britain, shot down in World War One. Okay, and 27,000. So over 100,000 planes were shot down. That's 25,000 a year. Okay, now 25,000 planes a year, we've got 12 months in a year, right? So that means they're making, what, 2,000 planes a month? How are they doing this? And how were they training that many pilots? And of course, they tell us that many of these planes, the early ones, were actually wooden framed with a canvas skin put on them. And we've got a quote here that says, a great deal of airplanes could be holed, shot and have holes put in them without affecting its ability to fly. Wings and fuselage could be, and often were, pierced in 50 places, missing the occupants by inches, who were blissfully unaware of how close they had come until they returned to base. Then the sailmaker would carefully cover each hole with a square inch of Irish linen, frayed at the edges, and with a brush of dope, to make our aircraft serviceable again within the hour. And that's by Cecil Lewis. So this is the story we're given, that these early planes were wood covered in a canvas skin, and they were flying around. But when we go back and have a look at the aeroplanes that they had and the pictures that we have of them, I did find one that looked like it was made of canvas, which is here. Okay, but many of these other aeroplanes are clearly not canvas. Okay, these are metal. Now, building a wood canvas aeroplane would probably be faster, I would think, than building a metal one. Because when you get into metal, you've then got to get the sheet metal, you've got to bend it. There's a lot more mechanical parts that go into them. They start to become heavier, so you need, broader and heavier wings with more lift. And it just gets more and more complicated. But we are told, like I said, that they were doing this. The first aircraft used in the war was just 11 years after the first flight at Kitty Hawk. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about this? Is that even possible? Especially when we look at the bicycle. Okay, we've seen this is Wilbur and Orville's bicycle, and this is from the 1890s. Okay, they went from the penny farthing to this. And 120 plus years later, what do we have as far as bicycle technology? Pretty much the same thing. Like the biggest change we've seen in bicycles was probably in the 80s when we had the BMX brought in, but that's really just the same kind of design. We had the choppers of the 70s, which were slightly different, but it's the same basic design. And when we look at the top performing bicycles, the most advanced bicycles, they are literally the same as this. Okay, just different alloys for the frame. The tires might be a bit thinner and better, maybe better bearings in the crankshaft, but it is the same machine. We've had no steps forward in technology as far as bicycles, but when it comes to planes, we went from a 59-second flight, which was the fourth attempt in 1903, to combat planes, thousands, tens of thousands of combat aircraft in World War I between 1914 and 1918. Okay, we've all heard the story of the airships, and we definitely know that they were around and being used. But of course, they were taken out of commission and basically made illegal, right? That technology was taken from us and we weren't allowed to use it after the Hindenburg. But aeroplanes, they jumped forward from the first powered flight, which was this. Basically, you can see the engine here, and they're just sitting on the bottom wing pretty much, and they had a couple of levers. There's no cockpit, there's no cabin or anything like that. There's no covering at all. It's literally a glider with a small engine attached. And of course, up in the background, we can see this, just to let us know that they were bicycle inventors, right? And look at their clothes. These guys don't look like, they were in the shed building planes. And that's just my opinion. But this is what we went from this to this in 11 years, or even if we go to the end of World War I, we're talking 15 years. 15 years, guys, from that first aeroplane, 1-minute flight, to these planes that are clearly metal, and they were doing dogfights, and they were carrying bombs, and they had machine guns mounted, and we suddenly had tens of thousands of pilots. So do you think this is even possible? So leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think, because this is the story that we've been sold. And when we look at it, as with most things in history, we find out it's just his story. It's just made up, and it doesn't make any sense at all when put under scrutiny. So thanks for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed that one. Please give me a like, share this around, and subscribe if you haven't already. But most of all, leave me a comment and let me know what you think about the narrative we've been given for heavier than air powered flight.
Remember, in the end, nobody wins unless everybody wins. Come on!